House by Jules Verne, translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 8. A Few Hours at Benares. The high road now lay open before our steam-house, a road which, via Sasaram, would lead us along the right bank of the Ganges up to Benares. A mile beyond the encampment our engine slackened its speed, and we proceeded at the more moderate pace of about 7 miles and a half an hour. It was Banks' intention to camp that evening 75 miles from Gaya, and to pass the night quietly in the neighborhood of the little town of Sasaram. In general, Indian roads avoid watercourses as much as possible, for they necessitate bridges, which are very expensive affairs to erect on that alluvial soil. In many places where it was found impossible to prevent a river or stream from barring the path, there is no means of transit except an ancient and clumsy ferry-boat, of no use for the conveyance of our train. Fortunately, however, we were independent. We had that very day to cross an important river, the Saone. This stream is fed above Rohtas by its affluents, the Koput and the Koil, and flows into the Ganges just between Ara and Dinapore. Nothing could be easier than our passage. The elephant took to the water quite naturally. It descended the gentle slope of the bank straight into the river, rested on the surface, and with its huge feet beating the water like a paddle-wheel, it quietly drew our floating train to the opposite bank. Captain Hood could not contain his delight. "A travelling house!" he would exclaim. "A house which is both a carriage and a steamboat. Now we only need wings to enable us to fly through the air, and thus to cleave space." "That will be done some day or other, Hood," rejoined the engineer quite seriously. "I believe it, Banks," answered the captain no less seriously. "It will be done. But what can't be done is that our life should be given back to us a couple of 100 years hence to enable us to see all these marvels. Life is not all sunshine, but yet I would willingly consent to live centuries out of pure curiosity." That evening, 12 hours after leaving Gaya, we passed under the magnificent tubular railway bridge, 80 feet above the bed of the Saone, and encamped in the environs of Sasaram. We merely wished to spend a night in this spot, to replenish our stock of wood and water, and start again at dawn of day. This program we carried out, and next morning, before the burning midday heat began, we were far on our way. The landscape was still much the same, that is, very rich and very cultivated. Such it appeared on approaching the marvelous valley of the Ganges. I will not stop to describe the numberless villages we passed lying in the midst of extensive rice fields, nestling amid groves of palms, interspersed with mangoes and other trees of magnificent growth and foliage. We never paused on our way, for even if the road was blocked by a cart drawn by slow-paced zebus, 2 or 3 shrieks from our whistle caused them to draw on one side, and we dashed past to the great amazement of the ryots. I was delighted and charmed at the sight of a great number of fields of roses. We were indeed not far distant from Gazipur, the great centre of production of the water, or rather essence, made from these flowers. I asked Banks if he could give me any information about this most valued product, which, in the matter of perfumery, seems to be the height of perfection. "Here is a calculation," was Banks' reply, "which will show you at once what a costly manufacture it is. 40 pounds of roses are first of all subjected to a sort of slow distillation over a gentle fire, and the whole yields about 30 pounds of rose-water. This is thrown onto another heap of 40 pounds of flowers, which, in its turn, is distilled until the mixture is reduced to 20 pounds. This is then exposed to the cool night air for 12 hours, and the next day is found congealed on the surface. How much do you think? 1 ounce of sweet-scented oil. So then, out of 80 pounds of roses, a quantity which they say contains not less than 200,000 flowers, is finally obtained but 1 ounce of liquid. Is it not a regular massacre? Therefore, it is not astonishing that, even in the country where it is made, the attar of roses should cost 40 rupees, or £4 the ounce. "Well," ejaculated Captain Hood, "if it required 80 pounds of grapes to make 1 ounce of brandy, grog would soon become a costly beverage." We now crossed the Karamanka, one of the affluents of the Ganges. The Hindus have made of this poor innocent river a sort of Styx, and believe it very unlucky and unsafe for navigation. Its banks are no less accursed than those of the Dead Sea. Bodies which are entrusted to it are carried straight to the Brahminical hell. I will not discuss these beliefs, but as to admitting that the water of this diabolical river is disagreeable to the taste or unwholesome, I protest against it, and assert that it is excellent. That evening, having traversed a tolerably level country between immense fields of poppies and tracts of rice, marked out like a chessboard, we camped on the right bank of the Ganges, before the ancient Jerusalem of the Hindus, the sacred city of Benares. 24 hours' halt here," said Banks. "At what distance from Calcutta are we now?" I asked the engineer. "About 350 miles," he replied. "And you acknowledge, my friend, do you not, that we have felt nothing of the length of the way or the fatigue of the journey?" The Ganges! Is not that a name which calls up the most poetic legends, and does it not seem as if all India was summed up in that word? Is there in the world a valley to be compared to this, extending over a space of 1,500 miles, and containing not less than 100 millions inhabitants? Is there a spot on the globe where more wonders have been heaped up since the appearance of the Asiatic races? What would not Victor Hugo have said of the Ganges, when he has so proudly sung the Danube? Yes, a river is worth something which can say of itself that it has "Comment mer ça roule, quand sur le globe en déroule, comme un serpent en quand enroule, de l'Occident à l'Orient." But the Ganges has billows and cyclones more terrible than the storms of the European river. The Ganges winds like a serpent through the most poetic countries in the world, and the Ganges flows from west to east, but it is in no ordinary range of hills that it takes its source. It flows from the highest chains in the globe, from the mountains of Tibet, and dashes down, absorbing all its tributaries on the way. It is among the Himalayas themselves that it springs into being. When we looked out the next morning, the 23rd of May, the rising sun was shining on the sheet of water spread out before our eyes. Several alligators of great size lay on the white sand, as if drinking in the early sunlight. Motionless, they were turned towards the radiant orb, as if they had been the most faithful votaries of Brahma. But the sight of several corpses floating by aroused them from their adoration. It is said that these bodies float on the back when they are men, and on the chest when they are women, but from personal observations I can state that there is no truth in this statement. In a moment the monsters had darted on the prey, daily furnished them on the waters of these rivers, and with it plunged into the depths. The Calcutta Railway, before branching off at Allahabad to run towards Delhi, keeps close to the right bank of the Ganges, although it does not follow the river in all its numerous windings. At the Mughal Serai station, from which we were but a few miles distant, a small branch line turns off, which passes Benares by crossing the river, and passing through the valley of the Gumti, reaches Jaunpur at a distance of about 35 miles. Benares lies on the left bank, but it was at Allahabad, and not here, that we were to cross the Ganges. Our behemoth stood, therefore, in the encampment we had chosen on the evening of the 22nd of May. Several boats were moored to the bank, ready to take us across to the sacred town, which I was very desirous of exploring carefully. These cities had been so often visited by Colonel Monroe that there was really nothing new to him to learn or see in this one. He had, however, at first thought of accompanying us that day, but on reflection decided to make an excursion along the banks of the river instead, with Sergeant McNeil as his companion. So the two quitted Steamhouse before we ourselves had started. Captain Hood had at one time been quartered at Benares, and he was anxious to go and see a few of his old friends there. Banks and I, therefore, the engineer having expressed a wish to be my guide, were the only members of our party whom a feeling of curiosity attracted to the city. When I say that Captain Hood had once been quartered at Benares, it must be understood that the English troops are not usually quartered in Hindu towns. Their barracks are situated in cantonments, which in reality became regular English towns. Such is the case at Allahabad, Benares, and several other places in the country, where not only soldiers, but officials, merchants, and gentlemen live by preference. Each of these great cities has, therefore, a double, one possessing all the comforts of modern Europe, the other having preserved the customs of the country and the Hindu usages in all their local color. The English town annexed to Benares is called Sekrol, and its bungalows, avenues, and Christian churches are not particularly interesting to visit. Here, too, are found the principal hotels frequented by tourists. Sekrol is one of those ready-made cities which the manufacturers of the United Kingdom can send out in boxes, ready to be set up on the premises. It therefore presents nothing curious. Banks and I embarked in a boat and crossed the Ganges obliquely, so as to get a beautiful view of the magnificent amphitheatre in which Benares lies. "Benares," said Banks, "is the most holy city of India. It is the Hindu Mecca, and whoever has lived in it, if only for 24 hours, is assured of eternal happiness. One can imagine, then, what an enormous crowd of pilgrims such a belief could attract thither, and what a great population must reside in a city for which Brahma has reserved blessings of such importance." Benares is supposed to have existed for more than 30 centuries, and must therefore have been founded about the time when Troy disappeared. It always exercised a great influence, not political but spiritual, over Hindustan, and was the authorized center of Buddhist religion until the 9th century. A religious revolution then occurred. Brahmanism destroyed the ancient worship. Benares became the Brahmin capital, the center of attraction to the faithful, and it is said that 300,000 pilgrims visit it annually. The holy city still has its Raja. Though he is a stipendiary of the British, and his salary somewhat poor, he is still a prince, and inhabits a magnificent residence at Ramnagur on the Ganges. He is a veritable descendant of the kings of Kasi, the ancient name of Benares, but has no real influence, though he would console himself for that if his pension had not been reduced to 1,00,000 of rupees, which is 100,000 rupees, or 10,000 lakh, only enough for the pocket-money of a nabob in the old times. Benares, like all towns in the valley of the Ganges, took part in the great insurrection of 1857. Its garrison at this time composed of the 37th Regiment of Native Infantry, a corps of irregular cavalry, and half a Sikh regiment. The English troops consisted merely of half a battery of artillery. This handful of men could not attempt to disarm the native soldiers. The authorities therefore waited with impatience for the arrival of Colonel Neil, who set out for Allahabad with the 10th Regiment. Colonel Neil entered Benares with only 250 men, and gave orders for a parade on the drill ground. When all were assembled, the sepoys were told to give up their arms. They refused. A fight then ensued between them and Colonel Neil's infantry. The irregular cavalry almost immediately joined the mutineers, as did the Sikhs, who believed themselves betrayed. The half-battery, however, opened fire on them, and notwithstanding that they fought with valor and desperation, all were put to the rout. This fight took place outside the town. Inside, there was an attempt at insurrection on the part of the Mussulmans, who hoisted the green flag, but this was soon quelled. From that time, and throughout the rest of the revolt, Benares was troubled no more, even at the time when the insurrection appeared triumphant in the provinces of the west. These details Banks gave me as our boat glided slowly over the water of the Ganges. "My dear fellow," he remarked, "you are now going to pay your first visit to Benares. But although this city is so ancient, you must not expect to find in it any monument more than 300 years old. Don't be astonished at this. It is the consequence of those religious contests in which fire and sword has played such a lamentable part. But all the same, Benares is a very remarkable and curious town, and you will not regret an excursion to it." We now stopped our boat at a suitable distance to allow us to gaze across a bay as blue as that of Naples, at the picturesque amphitheatre of terraced houses and palaces descending to the water's edge, some of them projecting over the river, so that the waves constantly washed their base and appeared likely some day to undermine them. A pagoda of Chinese architecture consecrated to Buddha, a perfect forest of towers, spires, and minarets, beautified the city, studded as it was with mosques and temples, the latter surmounted by the lingam, one of the symbols of Siva, whilst the lofty Mohammedan mosque built by Aurangzeb crowned the marvelous panorama. Instead of disembarking at one of the ghats, or flights of stone steps leading from the banks of the river up to the terraces, Banks directed the boatman to take us first past the quay. Here I found the scene at Gaya reproduced, though a different landscape. Instead of the green forests of the Falgo, we had this holy city for a background, but the life part of the picture was much the same. Thousands of pilgrims covered the banks, the terraces, the stairs, and devoutly plunged into the stream, in rows of 3 or 4 deep. It must not be imagined that this bath was free. Sentries in red turbans, with sabres at their sides, stood on the lower steps of the ghats, and exacted tribute, in company with industrious Brahmins who sold chaplets, amulets, charms, and other religious articles. But besides the pilgrims who bathed on their own account, there were also traders whose only business was to draw this most sacred water and transport it to the distant parts of the peninsula. As a security, each phial is marked with the seal of the Brahmins. But in spite of this, fraud is carried on to a great extent, as the exportation of this miraculous liquid is so considerable. Perhaps, as Banks said to me, all the water of the Ganges would not be sufficient to supply the wants of the faithful. I asked if these bathers did not often meet with accidents, for no one seemed to try to prevent such a thing. There were no swimmers to prevent imprudent people from venturing too far into the rapid current. "Accidents are indeed frequent," answered Banks. "But if the body of the devotee is lost, his soul is saved. Therefore they do not concern themselves much about it." "And crocodiles?" I added. "Crocodiles," replied Banks, "usually keep their distance. All this noise terrifies them. These monsters are not to be feared so much as villains who dive under the water, seize women and children, and tear off their jewels. There is even a story about one of these wretches, who, by means of an artificial head, played the part of a crocodile for a long time, and made quite a little fortune by this profitable, though dangerous trade. Finally, this impertinent intruder was devoured one day by a real alligator, and nothing was found of him but his head of tanned skin floating on the surface of the water. There are also desperate fanatics who voluntarily seek death in the depths of the Ganges. and this they do with a curious species of refinement. Round their body they tie a chaplet of open but empty urns. Gradually the water fills these vessels, and the devotee gently sinks down, amid the applause of the crowd. Our boat at last landed us at the Manmenka Ghat. Here were arranged in layers the funeral piles on which the corpses of all those who in their lifetime had had any care for their future existence were burnt. In this sacred spot, cremation is eagerly sought for by the faithful, and these funeral pyres burn night and day. Rich babus of distant territories cause themselves to be carried to Benares as soon as they are attacked by an illness which they feel will prove fatal. Benares is unquestionably the best starting point for a journey to the other world. If the deceased has only to reproach himself with venial faults, his soul is wafted on the smoke of the Manmenka straight to the regions of eternal bliss. If, on the contrary, he has been a great sinner, his soul must go and inhabit the body of a Brahmin yet to be born, for the purpose of being regenerated. It is to be hoped that his second life will be exemplary, or he will be exposed to a third trial before he is finally admitted to share the delights of Brahma's heaven. The rest of the day we devoted to exploring the town, its principal monuments and its bazaars, lined with dark shops after the Arab fashion. Here they sold principally fine muslin of beautiful texture, and kincob, a rich silk material brocaded with gold, which is one of the principal products of the Benares industry. The streets were clean, but so narrow as almost to prevent the sun's rays from penetrating to the pavement. But although it was shady, the heat was stifling. I pitied the bearers of our palanquin, who yet seemed to make no complaint themselves. However, it being an opportunity for the poor wretches to earn a few rupees was sufficient to give them strength and spirit. But a certain Hindu, or rather Bengali, with a keen eye and cunning expression, had no such reason for following us as he did the whole day without much attempt at concealment. As we landed at the Manmenka Ghat, I had been speaking to Banks, and uttered aloud the name of Colonel Munro. The Bengali, who was watching our boat put in, gave an evident start. I did not at the time pay much attention to this, but recalled the circumstance when I perceived the spy incessantly dogging our steps. He only left us to appear again, either before or behind, a few minutes later. Whether friend or foe I could not tell, but that he was a man to whom the name of Colonel Munro was not indifferent was perfectly evident. Our palanquin soon stopped at the foot of a staircase of 100 steps, leading from the quay to the Mosque of Aurangzeb. Formerly the devotees only ascended the Santa Scala on their knees, after the manner of the faithful at Rome, but that was when a magnificent Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu was on the site now occupied by the Mosque of the Conqueror. I should much have liked to survey Benares from the top of one of these minarets of this mosque, the construction of which is regarded as a perfect triumph of architecture. Although 132 feet in height, they have scarcely the diameter of a manufactory chimney, and yet the cylindrical shaft contains a winding stair. No one is allowed to ascend, and there is a reason for this prohibition. The 2 minarets are already sensibly out of perpendicular, and unless endowed with the vitality of the Tower of Pisa, they will end by coming down some day. On leaving the Mosque of Aurangzeb, I found the Bengali waiting for us at the door. This time I looked fixedly at him, and he lowered his eyes. Before drawing Banks' attention to this incident, I wished to ascertain if this individual would persist in his suspicious behavior, and for the present I said nothing. You may count pagodas and mosques by hundreds in this marvelous town of Benares. Also splendid palaces, the most beautiful of which is unquestionably that of the King of Nagpur. Few Rajas indeed neglect to secure a house in the holy city, and always come to it at the time of the great religious festivals of Mila. I could not attempt to visit all these buildings during the little time we had at our disposal. I contented myself, therefore, with making a visit to the temple of Bicheshwar, in which is set up the lingam of Siva. This, a shapeless stone, looked upon as a part of the body of this the most savage god of the Hindu mythology, covers a well the stagnant waters of which possess, they say, miraculous virtues. I saw also the Mankarnika, or sacred fountain, where devotees bathe, to the great prophet of the Brahmins. Then the Man Mandir, an observatory built 200 years ago by the Emperor Akbar. I had heard of a palace of monkeys, which all tourists never fail to visit. A Parisian naturally imagined himself about to behold something like the celebrated monkey house in the Jardin des Plantes. But there was nothing of the sort. I found that this palace was a temple called the Durga Kund, situated a little beyond the outskirts. The monkeys were by no means shut up in cages. They roamed freely through the courts, leaping from wall to wall, climbing to the tops of enormous mango trees, noisily disputing over the parched corn brought by their visitors, and to which they are very partial. There, as everywhere else, the Brahmins, who keep the Durga Kund, levy a small contribution, which evidently makes this profession one of the most lucrative in India. It is needless to say that we were rather done up by the heat, as towards evening we began to think of returning to Steam House. We had breakfasted and dined at Sikroll, in one of the best hotels of that English town, and yet I must say that the cuisine made us regret that of Monsieur Parizard. As we were stepping into our boat to return to the right bank of the Ganges, I again caught sight of the Bengalee a short distance from us. A skiff containing a Hindu was waiting for him, in which he got. Did he mean to cross the river, and so follow us to our encampment? This looked suspicious. "Banks," said I in a low tone, pointing to the Bengalee, "that fellow is a spy, who has followed us every step of the way." "I have seen him," returned Banks, "and I also noticed that it was the Colonel's name uttered by you which first put him on the alert." "Isn't there any—" I said. "No, leave him alone," said Banks. "Better not to let him know that he is suspected. Besides, he is gone now." In fact, the Bengalee's canoe had already disappeared amongst the numerous vessels of all shapes and sizes, covering the dark waters of the Ganges. Banks turned to our boatman. "Do you know that man?" he asked, in a tone of affected indifference. "No, this is the first time I have seen him," replied the native. Night fell. Hundreds of boats, dressed with flags illuminated with many-colored lanterns, and filled with singers and instrumentalists, glided here and there over the surface of the water. From the left bank rose beautiful and varied fireworks, reminding me that we were not far from the Celestial Empire, where they are held in such favor. It would be difficult to give a description of this really matchless spectacle. Of course, we could not tell for what reason or in whose honor this night festival was held, but all the classes of the Hindus took part in it. Just as it ended, our boat touched the opposite bank. It was like a dream. These beautiful and ephemeral fires illuminated space for a moment, and then died away in the blackness of night. But, as I said before, India worships 300 millions of gods, demigods, saints, and demi-saints, of every kind and description, so that the year has not enough hours, minutes, or seconds to devote even one to each of their divinities. On reaching our encampment, we found Colonel Monroe and Sergeant McNeil already there. Banks asked the sergeant if anything had happened during our absence. "Nothing," was the reply. "You haven't seen any suspicious-looking person prowling about?" "No, Mr. Banks. Have you any reason for suspecting?" "We have been dogged during our excursion in Benares," answered the engineer, "and I did not like the look of the fellow who followed us." "The spy was a Bengalee, who was put on the alert by the mention of Colonel Monroe's name." "What could the man want with us?" "I don't know, McNeil. We must keep a lookout." "We will," returned the sergeant emphatically. End of Book 1, Chapter 8.